Hello, this is Justin, and this is a book review of Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson. If you're new to this channel, we talk about great books and inspire people to read. So if you love reading and if you love great books, then subscribe and hit the bell notifications. Without further ado, let's get into the book review. Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson is one of my favorite books of all time. This biography is very inspiring to me because it talks about a man who really changed the world and left a legacy that we still feel today. Because a lot of the technologies we take for granted today, from smartphones to how we listen to music to personal computers, were all developed by Steve Jobs. So I think it's both a fascinating story on how the technologies we use today came to be, and also a fascinating biography about a fascinating man. He's very inspirational, so I picked up this book recently to reread it because I actually read this biography in 2016 when I was in high school, and I loved the book immediately. It was already one of my favorite books. And as I progressed into my adult life, I wanted to draw inspiration again because reading about successful people is inspiring, and it also motivates you to become successful yourself. Not only that, but you learn a lot of life lessons that they went through in order to get where they were. So I think reading biographies of people like Steve Jobs is important because it teaches you and motivates you to be successful yourself. So let's get into Steve Jobs. I think a big theme from this book is that Steve Jobs was a maverick. He had a rebellious nature and an independent nature, and that allowed him to challenge the status quo and to reject the world as it is, to mold it to fit his imaginations. He had a lot of ideas, and he was a visionary, and he had a lot of passion for creating great products for people, for everybody, so that the world would become a different place where people could use their own devices, high-tech devices, and be creative. I think that's very important because if you just accept the world as it is, you won't have the drive to really change it. And I think this is what Steve Jobs showed in his biography. Now, to give you some background about Steve Jobs' childhood, he was born in 1955 to an unwed mother. His biological mother didn't want to marry his biological father, or she couldn't really marry his biological father because her father was very opposed to the match, because Steve Jobs' biological father was a Muslim and a Syrian, and Steve Jobs' biological grandfather on his mother's side didn't like that. He was Catholic and he didn't want his daughter to marry a Muslim. So his daughter gave up the baby for adoption. And Steve Jobs was adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs of California. They lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, right inside Silicon Valley. And that affected Steve Jobs' development as a kid and as an adult, because living in Silicon Valley exposed Steve to all these great companies, these great tech companies, and all these great engineers, and that inspired him to be a tech entrepreneur who created technology products that changed the world. Steve Jobs was very troublesome as a kid. He was very rebellious and disdained authority, and he would often play pranks on other people. It was this habit of playing pranks that led him to meet his future business partner, Steve Wozniak. They were introduced by mutual friends because both Jobs and Wozniak were very into playing pranks and also into electronics. So they clicked very quickly and they played pranks together and built electronics together for fun. And it wasn't only for fun because Steve Jobs had a way to make money from it. So one device they built was called the Blue Box, which would allow them to make long-distance phone calls for free. And Steve Jobs said, let's not do this just for fun. Let's try to make money. So already he had an entrepreneurial streak as a kid and made money from selling blue boxes and other cool devices he made with Wozniak. When Jobs graduated from high school, he attended Reed College, where he got involved with the hippie subculture. He was very much a child of the 60s and attended Hare Krishna temples, practiced Zen Buddhism, and even took a 7-month trip to India to find spiritual enlightenment. He also lived in hippie communes and was just a stereotypical hippie. But he went back to his parents' place afterwards and got into the technology business because they lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, right inside Silicon Valley. So Steve Jobs was surrounded by technology companies, had a lot of exposure to that and the people who worked in those companies. And he worked at Atari as a technician, acquiring some technical expertise, but on his downtime he would hang out with Steve Wozniak, and they would play pranks on other people and attended the Homebrew Computer Club, which was a hobbyist computer club. So this was in the 1970s, where computers were quite new to everyone. They weren't really common. So people who were hobbyists with computers tended to congregate and meet with each other. And it was at this computer club that Steve and the two Steves, Wozniak and Jobs, started making their own computers and started selling to electronic stores. So they decided to make their own company called Apple Computers, which was named after Steve Jobs' diet of eating apples, and also the last commune he lived in had an apple orchard. So they named the company Apple Computers and started selling the electronics and computers they made. Very quickly, a big investor named Mike Markkula found out about them and invested $250,000 to scale the company. Now, this was the 1970s, and $250,000 was quite a lot. So they scaled pretty quickly, and they were joined by other investors, and eventually they created the Apple II computer, which was a giant success and launched the company into a huge success. And they sold a lot of computers well into the 1980s with just the Apple II. Later on, they would develop the Macintosh, which was also a giant success. So Steve Jobs quickly became very successful in his 20s and found success at a very young age. But within his company, he didn't think he was experienced enough to be CEO. And Wozniak didn't either. So they hired outsiders to be CEOs of Apple, even though Steve Jobs was the main spokesman and the chairman of the board and the co-founder. I'm not going to get into too much detail about everything Steve Jobs did at Apple in the 1980s because there would be too much to say, but I will go into his personality and his management style because I think that's important to know. Steve Jobs was a very passionate leader, and he was very passionate about the products he created. He considered himself an artist, and he considered the products he made as works of art. And one of the reasons why Apple was so successful then and even later on in Steve's career was because the engineers were creating products they themselves wanted to use. And Steve Jobs was very passionate about all the products they made. However, that sometimes crossed the line into extreme perfectionism, and he would harass his employees for being substandard. He would call them B players, tell them their work is crap, and also were really nasty to them. He would give them very demanding deadlines and berate them for failing to get close to the deadlines sometimes. And one toxic thing that Steve did was that often someone would come up to Steve to talk about an idea that they had. And Steve Jobs would say, "That idea is crap." A few days later, Steve would go to a team meeting and present the same idea as if he came up with that idea himself. So he took credit for other people's ideas. That was toxic. Some people confronted him about it, but he brushed it off. But generally, he had two sides of him. He was charismatic and passionate about the company and the products on one hand, but he was also a toxic manager. Employees said he had a reality distortion field, which basically means that he would be able to convince you of anything. Some employees said that you were able to do the impossible because Steve Jobs convinced you it wasn't impossible. And that's how they got a lot of deadlines achieved and were able to do very great things like developing the graphical user interface system, which they first found out from visiting the Xerox labs, but they really developed it into something that consumers could use. But Steve Jobs was eventually ousted from Apple because of his toxic style. The board of directors didn't like how he was very immature in the office. He would cry in public when things don't go his way, throw fits, and talk badly about the CEO behind his back. So the board forced the CEO, John Sculley, to remove Jobs from the Macintosh team and offered Jobs to be the head of the Apple Labs R&D department, which was what they thought a good alternative because Steve Jobs was still very passionate about developing good technologies. He was just a toxic manager, so they wanted to do that, but Steve refused, and there was a showdown in the boardroom, and the board sided with John Sculley. So Steve Jobs was forced out of the company, and even though Sculley was still conciliatory, Steve kept trying to enlist support to create a rebellion to oust Sculley from Apple. So Sculley removed the option for Steve to be head of Apple Labs and just forced him out of the company. So after he was ousted from Apple in 1985, Steve Jobs founded Nix Computers, which focused on selling to the higher education market and the more professional business workstation market. It was mildly successful. He was funded by Ross Perot, the Texas billionaire, and it was an okay business. It actually had profits, but it wasn't a giant success like Apple was. However, Steve was giantly successful with Pixar. So Pixar was spun out of Lucasfilm, and it was the graphic design division of Lucasfilm. And Steve Jobs acquired it and became its head. I think he became his CEO or chairman or both. And he was very successful with Pixar because he had a talented creative director, creative chief named John Lasseter. And he created a lot of the blockbuster animation films that we cherish today. Films like Toy Story, Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, Cars, Ratatouille, The Bug Life, all were developed by Pixar when Steve Jobs was head of Pixar. So he was very successful with Pixar, and eventually in 2006, Disney would acquire Pixar, and Steve Jobs would end up as the biggest shareholder of Disney. And that led to a lot of his wealth generation, actually, because Disney, his shares in Disney were very big, and that grew a lot from his initial investment from Pixar. And I think that was even bigger than how much money he made in Apple. I'm not completely sure about this. I don't remember off the top of my head, but he did make a lot of money just from Pixar and Disney, even though most people remember him just from Apple. So that was his Disney Pixar story. Meanwhile, Apple was declining after Steve Jobs left. In the late 80s, it didn't do as well. And in the 90s, it was doing terribly. It was declining. And in 1996, they couldn't even build their own operating system. So they decided to acquire Nix Computers from Steve Jobs to take their operating system. And that brought Steve Jobs back to Apple. So the CEO of Apple at the time was named Gil Amelio, and the board didn't like him because of the bad performance of Apple, and they wanted Steve Jobs back. So they fired Amelio. Steve Jobs still had responsibilities at Pixar, so he was hesitant. He didn't join full-time. He joined as an advisor. So they hired a guy named Fred Anderson to be the interim CEO. And he would take his cues from Jobs because even though Jobs was the advisor, he was really the power behind everything at Apple. And eventually, Jobs would take over as interim CEO and permanent CEO. And this second tenure at Apple is what most people remember Jobs for, because this is when Jobs developed the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, and the iPad, which were revolutionary products that completely changed the world and completely changed how we use technology. The iMac completely revamped the personal computer industry. Before the iMac, people considered computers as pretty boring devices, and they were mostly used for work, but sometimes for personal use, but they weren't very attractive. They were boring devices that you use. But the iMac had a very sleek and appealing and attractive design. They made computers fun and liberating to use. It was very intuitive to use an iMac. So it completely revamped the computer industry. Moreover, when Steve Jobs took over Apple in 1997, Apple was doing terrible. And one of the reasons why was because there were so many unnecessary products and so many different versions of the same product. So Steve Jobs said this is very wasteful. It's very bad for our company because it doesn't allow us to focus on on a few products that we can sell very well. So what Steve Jobs did was that he drew a chart, and the chart had 2 rows and 2 columns. One column was named Consumer, the other was named Pro. One row was named Portable, the other was named Desktop. And they would have 4 computer products for the 4 categories. That was it. And that cut down a lot of excess inventory. They got rid of a lot of unnecessary products so they could focus on 4 great computer products, and that was it. Moreover, Steve Jobs completely revolutionized the music industry with the iPod. The iPod was completely transforming to how we listen to music. And that really changed things and made Steve Jobs a very successful businessman, and people became appreciating how much he was turning Apple around and making it not just a successful and profitable company, but also a innovative company. But I think the most revolutionary device that Steve Jobs introduced was the iPhone. The iPhone ushered in the smartphone age, which is so ingrained into how we live our lives today. If you think about it, a smartphone in our pocket can do so many things for us. We could use it to communicate with people through texting or calling or emails. We could check the weather with it. We could navigate through Google Maps. We could Google something, use the internet. We could play games on it. We could order food. We could order a car service like Uber or Lyft. There's so much to do with a smartphone that it is so ingrained into our lives right now. And it all came about through that day in 2007 when Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone 1. It was basically one device that rolled the purposes of 3 devices together. It was a computer on one hand, it was also a phone because you can make phone calls and text people, and it was also an iPod because you could listen to music on it. So I think that was the biggest product he introduced that really changed the world. He also introduced the iPad that completely changed the tablet computing industry as well. So Steve Jobs' second tenure at Apple was very groundbreaking because that was what we remember Steve Jobs for. All the products he made during this time period that changed the world and that we take for granted today all came from that second tenure at Apple. Another thing about Steve Jobs was that he brought back the old Apple image of being a maverick and challenging the status quo. He had the Think Different campaign carried out, the marketing campaign carried out, and that was a giant success. Apple, as a brand, completely rebranded itself. It wasn't as boring as it was when it was run by people in the 90s before Steve Jobs came back. And it became a fun brand that had an emotional appeal. Moreover, he used very catchy slogans like 1,000 songs in your pocket when he was selling the iPod. And that just demonstrates how good of a marketer Steve Jobs was. Moreover, Steve Jobs was very good at product unveilings. He would offer exclusive rights to different news agencies so that all at the same time, all the news agencies would be talking about his product. And at the same time, he was a very charismatic presenter. So that only added to the media hype and made a lot of the products he introduced to the world very successful. So that was Steve Jobs' life as a businessman, entrepreneur, and inventor. But what about his personal life? I think Steve Jobs had a more complicated personal life because, yes, he was given up for adoption and abandoned by his birth parents, but ironically, he would do the same thing to his first child, Lisa. Steve Jobs had a baby daughter, Lisa, with his high school girlfriend in the late 1970s, and he first denied paternity, but was later forced to contribute to Lisa's livelihood because he took a paternity test that showed that he was the father. But he would remain pretty distant from Lisa until Lisa was in high school. In the meantime, Steve Jobs had several serious relationships and ended up marrying a woman named Laureen Powell. They met at Stanford when Steve Jobs was giving a lecture at Stanford Business School, and Laureen was a business student there. And they hit it off pretty well and got married in 1991 and had 3 children, and by all accounts had a pretty stable and happy family life. And when Lisa was in high school, Steve invited her to move into his house. But even after that, they had a rocky relationship until Steve Jobs' fight with cancer, which kind of ends the biography because even though he was very successful, at the same time he was fighting cancer. Steve Jobs wasn't able to beat his cancer. He was able to beat a lot of his business challenges, but he couldn't beat his own health problems. And one of the reasons why was because he refused the first chance to do a surgery when it was discovered that he had a tumor in his pancreas, because he wanted to use natural remedies through his vegan diet to heal himself, which didn't work. So he could be still alive today if he took that surgery and not go the natural remedy route, but he didn't do that, and he regretted that, and later on his cancer spread and he died age 56 in 2011. Steve Jobs left a very powerful legacy. He revolutionized multiple industries, from personal computers to animated movies, to music, to phones, to tablet computing and digital publishing. The products he made, the Apple II, the Macintosh, completely changed the personal computer industry. Previously, computers were only sold as workstations to professionals, but Steve Jobs made it a tool for everyone to use. And later he would revamp the computer industry with the iMac. And he completely changed the animated movie industry with Pixar. And when he introduced the iPod, that changed how we consume music, which was very big. And his introduction of the iPhone completely ushered in a new age where we use smartphones for so many different purposes. And of course, the iPad changed tablet computing, and all the products he made allowed people to publish things online and read online, and that changed the digital publishing industry. So he left a very strong legacy on multiple industries and was a titan that changed the world and left a dent in the universe. I think one of my favorite quotes from Steve Jobs is that it is the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world that actually do. And Steve Jobs was a maverick. He thought differently from everyone else, and even when people doubted him, he carried through with his conviction and changed the world, and I think that is very inspiring. Steve Jobs is one of my favorite books of all time. If you would like to read it yourself, there's an Amazon link in the description. Also, follow me on Instagram for more personal content, and follow me on Medium, where I post more in-depth articles and essays on book reviews. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.